This is 15 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by the Natural Gas Supply Association. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on energy infrastructure permitting, we're going to talk with Professor David Adelman, who holds the Harry M. Reasoner Regents Chair in Law at the University of Texas, Austin. We're going to talk about Professor Adelman's groundbreaking work on why the solutions to streamlining permitting are at the state and local levels, not in the federal policy fixes proposed on Capitol Hill. Professor Adelman has been at the University of Texas Law School since 2009 after practicing law in Washington, D.C. He specializes in environmental and administrative law and climate change and energy policy. He did the first ever quantitative study of federal permitting practices, which found that less than 5% of wind and solar projects required federal environmental reviews. And that showed that addressing state and local obstructions is needed to get infrastructure built. So, Professor Adelman, a lot of lawmakers are seeking solutions to permitting delays in reforms of federal requirements imposed by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Tell us, what is NEPA? Do you think reforming it is a solution to getting infrastructure built? I think you have some real interesting data on that.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this work in the current debate over permitting reform. So, NEPA is one of the foundational federal environmental statutes. What makes it distinctive is maybe two things. Um, One is its breadth. It covers an enormous range of projects. And it's basically the reason for that is there's a broad requirement, a broad range of projects that fall underneath it because the trigger for it itself is relatively broad. Basically, there has to be federal land, federal money, or some kind of federal permit involved, and that triggers some kind of NEPA review. The other aspect of it that's really distinctive is that NEPA is a purely procedural statute, so it doesn't have substantive requirements. It doesn't require, some limitation on emissions or impacts on endangered species or some kind of, let's say, impacts on waterway or something like that. All it requires the federal government to do is to evaluate the environmental impacts of a proposed action and consider the alternatives. And if the environmental impacts are significant, ideally to select an alternative that mitigates them. And work into that process is a public comment process. So it also serves as kind of a broad context for people to weigh in on an action that involves the federal government in some way.
Mm. Yeah, I've read that the original uh, act was passed by, proposed and passed by lawmakers who thought that these reviews that came out of it would be relatively straightforward, 150 pages, maybe a year or two, and that one of the concerns is that these things now run to volumes. I've covered projects that have volumes of NEPA review information. Um, do you think that those kinds of things could be reformed?
So, I mean, it's definitely true that and actually, I'm not sure we have good data on this, but so this is probably a little bit more anecdotal. But I think it is true that in the early days, the length of environmental reviews, and here we'll just focus on environmental impact statements. There are actually different tiers of environmental reviews. There's an environmental impact statement. There's sort of a weaker or smaller or shorter environmental assessment. And then there are what are referred to as categorical exclusions, which are basically rules that say certain classes of project don't require an environmental review at all.
Mm.
But the longest ones and the ones that have, you know, um, attracted the most attention in this particular context are environmental impact statements. And you're definitely right. There are examples of environmental impact statements that are literally thousands and thousands of pages. Yucca Mountain, which is sort of this infamous site where it was going to be long-term storage of high-level nuclear waste. That was, I mean, several thousand pages at least. Also, an enormously complex project. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a wide variation in the length of these documents. Um, I think there probably has been a trend to them being longer for more complex projects over time. It's also true that if you look at the number of EISs that are required over time, that number has diminished very dramatically. So
Mm.
back in the 1970s and 1980s, if we're just thinking about final environmental impact statements, about 1,000 per year. By the 1990s, it had dropped to around 300. It was in the 200s or so in the aughts. And today it's actually closer to maybe 90 per year. And so one reason that you might be seeing it's difficult to shorten the time for conducting an EIS and longer ones is in essence the projects that are falling under requiring an EIS, it appears that the threshold has gone up substantially. So that's something also to keep in mind. EISs are much, much more rare than they were even 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, and that's part of why I raised the question because you it's not that you anecdotally think they're more rare. You've done the data, so
Mhm.
you know. Let me ask you this though, one more thing about NEPA. Do you think that working through legislation that some of the things that people have proposed for reforms could move parties toward solutions? I know that you've talked about things like better permitting agency coordination and efficiencies and funding. Um, is that something that could come out of legislation, do you think?
Um, I mean, legislation in terms of appropriations, certainly. Um, it wouldn't necessarily require any kind of change in the statute. Like, the sorts of changes that we've been seeing are like timing requirements and page limits. And those are very kind of intuitive, simple interventions, but having them play it on the ground, like determining when the NEPA process starts is more art than science.
Hmm.
Page lengths can be avoided by using appendices. So they're, for better or worse, they're workarounds. And those are simple metrics and really complex processes. And certainly my view is um, we want to make the process as efficient as possible. But in numerous studies conducted by the GAO, we've seen,
Government Accounting Office.
yeah, the
Government
Government
Accounting.
Accounting Office that does independent reviews, as well as reviews within different federal agencies like the Federal Highway Administration, the Department of Energy, the U.S. Forest Service. This challenge of not having adequately trained agency staff or agency staff with sufficient experience and sort of just the barrier that's posed by just limited resources is a recurring theme, not just recently, but really over decades. And we see this, I'd say particularly with the US Forest Service, which often is struggling with limited resources, but we see it in virtually every federal agency. So I will absolutely agree that's a critical thing. With the current administration, which is seeking to defund the government and reduce staff, um, insofar as these statutes stay in place, that's going to make it more difficult because to process complex permits or do environmental reviews, you need well-trained agency staff and you need enough of them to do it, to just manage the workload.
But that's all coming from the allocation of funds, not really the reform of the law or anything, if I
It's
understand you
not.
correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, there are things that, I've talked with colleagues about, like clarifying the division between when an environmental assessment, which is shorter, both in length and the time required, and EIS. There could be work that could be done to clarify that distinction. You could also clarify what's required in an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, sort of on more substantive grounds as well. So those are things that you could do that would be complementary and help increase efficiency. Um, Again, when we sort of look at the empirical studies that have been done within the federal government, it's been less about kind of the substantive requirements of the statute and more about intra and interagency coordination and
Mm,
just having adequate resources. And
yeah.
we see even wide variation across agencies or within agencies with regard to the time it takes to prepare documents. And that more often than not has been driven by limited staff, limited resources.
Yeah, yeah. We had on the podcast someone who was with the DOE under the Biden administration who worked on a lot of programs that could have provided for that. We'll see if they turn up going forward. But I want to move to where the solutions are from based on your research, not based on my opinion, but based on your research. Um, I think you've talked about how there could be better practices at the state level that would streamline permitting. I've heard about duplicative state level reviews, reviews that duplicate federal reviews. Maybe that could be eliminated at the state level. You mentioned the timing and execution of reviews and the coordination of those things at the state level, because there's a certain way that state level practices can, I think you feel can be improved. Is that correct?
It is. I mean, so you started off by saying um, one of the reasons to, you know, believe or assert that federal environmental reviews and federal environmental permitting are not a significant barrier to, significant, let's just say, wind, solar, transmission line, and new energy infrastructure is that they're required on such a small number of the projects.
Right.
One important point to keep in mind is we do see a significant difference between whether the project is on private land, in which case almost never required, versus when the project is on public land or on public waters, where you have a federal nexus, and you have a much more higher likelihood of requiring an environmental review. And federal nexus can also create trigger requirements under the Endangered Species Act as well.
And
So
historic,
there's Mhm.
yeah, also historic preservation
Correct.
reviews.
That's a really significant statute, and talking to developers. Unfortunately, that is a really decentralized process, and I've actually wanted to collect data on that, and so far it's just been really, really difficult to get it, just because there's no centralized place to get it.
Mm.
Um, so I think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind. And the states come in here because you have these layers. You have like the federal environmental reviews and federal permits. In some states, like California, you also have state level environmental reviews under the California Environmental Quality Act, and you have state level permitting that's going to be required. There can be endangered species issues. Often the most important one is the local permitting. And
Yeah,
so,
we're going to talk about we're going to talk about local printing when you're finished talking about state level. But let's. I don't mean to interrupt you. I
sure.
apologize, but I want to make sure we're done with state because this local level issues are really really interesting.
Hmm.
Do you want to
So,
move to that now?
sure. Um, not all states have a variant of the National Environmental Policy Act. And I would say that California is a real outlier in terms of the scope of the statute and how
Ah,
rigorous it is.
yeah.
Um, and so, in terms of kind of duplicative efforts, um, probably the greatest potential is in California. But when you talk to state and federal actors, there's an enormous amount of coordination on both endangered species issues and environmental reviews between the federal authorities and the state authorities. That's not something that I've looked into personally, and what I know is more or less anecdotal, but there's definitely efforts to do that. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it also varies a lot. You know, some states don't have it at all. I would say California is one end of the spectrum, and there are a few other states that have comparable statutes, but to my knowledge, they're not as rigorous or as controversial as the California Environmental Quality Act.
This episode is brought to you by the Natural Gas Supply Association, a DC-based trade association that represents domestic producers and marketers of natural gas. Natural gas stands out as a fuel of choice for America's energy future. It is affordable, reliable, and sustainable. Today, natural gas powers a growing share of industrial facilities, data centers, homes, and also supports the expansion of renewable energy. The benefits of natural gas rely not only on expanding our nation's energy infrastructure, like pipelines and storage facilities, but also ensuring regulatory certainty so businesses can construct and maintain this infrastructure. The Natural Gas Supply Association advocates for permitting reform to streamline the process for approving necessary infrastructure projects without compromising environmental protections. The natural gas sector has proven itself adaptable and resilient, meeting rising demand while maintaining affordability. By investing in infrastructure, embracing permitting reform, and fostering a fact-based regulatory environment, we can ensure that natural gas continues to be a reliable foundation for America's energy future. It is our responsibility to strengthen this foundation today so that we can meet the energy demands of tomorrow. Learn more by visiting www.ngsa.org.
Interesting. Well, it's good to know. What I think is really valuable about what you have found is that you've made a distinction between anecdotal uh, stories about permitting delays and data-based information about permitting delays. And that's a tremendous contribution to the discussion. Um, and there's probably more work that you can do. So, here's your next paper, Professor Edelman. But I want to go to the local level.
Sure.
Your work found that a lot of progress is delayed at the local level, and that you suggest that engaging the public early and actively is very important, because if you try to streamline the approvals process past communities that are affected, it can actually exacerbate delays. You mentioned earlier Yucca Mountain. I think the people that lived around Yucca Mountain were really pleased that NEPA reviews took so long and were so vigorous. And I think that they also put up a lot of opposition at the local level. I've seen it in my reporting. I can tell you stories, but um, I want you to tell us stories. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on at the local level? And can you talk a little bit about maybe what you see as better practices to address the local obstacles to permitting projects?
Okay, so I would say um, like the Sabin Center at Columbia University does this annual report looking at um, basically inventorying the projects that have been opposed
Mhm.
and then looking to see, is it at the local level, is it at the state level, is it through some kind of federal litigation? And in their most recent report, it was, adding in some additional data to the work that they did, it's roughly 350 projects that were opposed. Um,
Mhm.
the vast majority of those projects are opposed through proceedings at the local level. So if you have a big wind or solar project, um, typically what they have to get is either a special use permit or a conditional use permit, and that's granted by, in essence, a local commission, like a county level commission is kind of the most typical variant of that. And they have enormous, sort of broad discretion whether or not they choose to grant those sorts of permits. And you can imagine they're, local people subject to
Local
local
politics.
pressure. and politics, and they've got a lot of discretion. And if there's a lot of public opposition, they have kind of broad rein to choose whether or not to grant a permit. In addition to that, many communities, and this has been inventoried by the national, I think, well, maybe it was LBNL. There was a government report that has done this. Sabin Center has done this as well. There are many localities have passed ordinances that impose restrictions on wind and solar development that either make it very costly or essentially prohibit it by imposing really large setbacks or height limitations or things like those sorts of things. So it can be through ordinance or it can be through case by case determination. Basically, projects can be held up that way. And there's a lot of latitude to do that. So in the work that I've done, if you look at the number of projects that have been opposed, only 12% of them involved any kind of federal litigation. Most of the opposition played out either through passing local ordinances, kind of after the fact or as the project was being proposed, or just rejecting a permit application at the local level.
Mm. Is there a way to, do you think there's a way to deal with that? I mean, a lot of people talk about community engagement. I suppose it's pretty hard to quantify the impact of community engagement. And I suppose, there's always two sides at the local level, or there often is anyway. Have you seen uh, any solutions, is I guess what I'm asking about.
So, I mean, there actually has been a significant amount of social science research on this.
Ah,
Um, and there are kind of two questions that have been raised by the social science. One is like, is this all about NIMBYism or are there other motivations at stake? And the answer on that has been sort of ambiguous. Like it often is a mix of what we might call NIMBYism, although that's never defined that well, and sort of genuine concerns about the landscape or environmental impacts. But the one key finding, and this is like over 200 papers, over 30 years of research. But one of the central, clear findings I have is the importance of early and significant community engagement, where the community feels like it's been consulted in a timely way, and it feels that it has a capacity to influence the project. That doesn't mean determine all aspects of the project. It doesn't mean that they have to get everything they ask for, but there has to be some sense that the project developer isn't coming to them at the last minute after virtually all of the major decisions have been made and they're just going through the motions. And if it's that type of process, it tends to taint the community's view of the project and actually increase the likelihood of public opposition. So, if we come back to NEPA, a timely NEPA process that is looking comprehensively at a project is very much consistent with what we're observing in the social science literature. The one thing I would say that where NEPA is different than what communities want is NEPA tends to be a more very technical sort of analysis.
mm,
And oftentimes, we're dealing with aesthetic concerns, more local concerns about impacts on the sort of feel of the landscape. And those are factors that weigh into the NEPA environmental reviews, but it doesn't perfectly fit. And you could do an environmental review in an EIS that wouldn't get quite at kind of the specific concerns of the local communities. And so if there's one way you could sort of see public engagement and even the NEPA process might be amended or modified, is sort of taking into account the importance of timing, taking into account, that it's important that the community feels like it has a say. It's not just a technocratic, objective analysis that's being done. It's that their values can weigh into and be a significant factor in how a project proceeds.
mm. Interesting. I want to ask you one more question. It's about a kind of a controversial uh, answer to permitting delays. And it came out of discussions I've had with several people, and uh, from reading one of my heroes, reporting and writing heroes, Robert Caro's book about a guy named Robert Moses who got a lot built in New York City back in the 50s and 60s, I think it was, and even into the 70s. But he really burned a lot of bridges. He offended a lot of people, and some of the great accomplishments that he had also were considered, sort of violations of local people's rights and privileges. And out of that sort of discussion of what he did comes one question. Is there a need for someone to have a final yes, no authority, or is that too dangerous to put in somebody's hands? Have you thought about that question?
Yeah, I mean, where it comes up in this context is if you look across the states, there have been a variety of different ways in which states have tried to mitigate the problem that we're discussing here. Is that, the perception of NIMBYism and projects are being, however you want to put it, unfairly or just for narrow-minded reasons being obstructed. And so the idea is that you would either place limitations on the ordinances that local governments could pass, or you create a state level process that's either, the developer can choose, or that's the way all wind and solar projects above a certain size are going to be permitted. And you basically circumvent local permitting altogether. And those are roughly the models that are being considered. There's still many states where it's all at the local level. There are actually a very small number of states where it's all at the state level. And there are a good number of states where they're sort of giving options or some flexibility encourage folks to permit projects at the local level, but giving them a state level option. Um, I'm
Do you
someone,
like one?
go ahead.
I was going to ask you. No, I was just going to ask you what I think you were just about to say. Do you like one of those options better than the other?
So um, I think the amount of development that we need to do is of a magnitude that often what we talk about now is social license. And I am skeptical that state level preemption, first of all, I think it would only work in Democratic controlled states, so you're going to lose all the Republican ones, that that's really a viable option. And I also am, I guess, a little more skeptical of the pejorative term NIMBYism. I think people have valid concerns about their connection to their local community and the impacts of any form of development. And so I guess where land is, I think it's reasonable for states in a thoughtful way to place some limitations on local governments to prevent them from putting just ridiculous restrictions on renewable development, like 1 mile setbacks for wind projects or something like that. But I think to the extent that we can empower local communities to negotiate effectively with developers, either through development agreements or community benefits agreements, which we see in many, many other settings, so not unique to renewable development in any shape or way, that's the avenue that I prefer. And I think one of the ways in which renewable developers and some states have done a disservice here is until at least recently, like in a state like Texas until 2023, uh, you actually had relatively little revenue going to the local communities because developers would negotiate very generous tax abatements for the first 5 to 10 years of their projects. And I think part of what we're seeing in the development community is an appreciation that development developers have to provide some really tangible benefits to local communities. And that's a little bit more challenging in the renewable setting because whereas there are lots of jobs during the construction of the projects, unlike a lot of other large scale development, there are actually not all that many jobs that are long term. And jobs are a really, really critical, tangible way in which communities see the value of development to them, because there are a lot spillover benefits associated with creating new jobs that actually expands the range of people who and businesses that benefit from a development that's typically on the scale of a big renewable project.
Mm. I have to say, I covered some of the first utility scale solar projects that were built in Southern California in the Antelope Valley. And one of the things that struck me is some of the developers came to these very small community groups very early on in the process. Quite frankly, it was tedious for them. But at one point, they were talking about providing, I think it was a park for the residents. And someone said, what about an ambulance? These people lived out in the desert, a
Yeah.
long way from any civil services. And the solar project developer was discussing with them the possibility of actually paying for an ambulance service. A second one, they had access to one very infrequent ambulance service that would take a long time to arrive. And that was another way that you could potentially turn NIMBYism into YIMBYism. I just wanted to throw that in. I want to thank my guest, Professor David Adelman, University of Texas Austin Law School, describing breakthrough quantitative work on energy project permitting and some of the solutions to the delays and barriers we have to getting really urgently needed new energy infrastructure built. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Natural Gas Supply Association. And as always, thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell everybody you know about our quest for energy transition solutions.